Now let's build the form that we will use to edit the restaurant data. So I want a form with a method equal to post because I do need the browser to send a post operation. We are editing data. That's not an operation that you want to do with an HTTP GET request. And to send the post, I'll add a button of type submit. Let's also give this some Bootstrap styling so that it appears as a button with the primary color, and with the text saved, the user will know where to click to save the restaurant information. Now, I want the user to edit the restaurant name, the location, and cuisine, but I also want this form to include the ID of the restaurant as a form value, because I want the form to include all the information that I need to put together to update a restaurant. But I don't necessarily want the user to edit the ID, and that's why when I add an input for the restaurant ID, I'm going to make it a hidden type. And then just like we did in the last module, I can say that this input is ASP-4 restaurant.id. And you might remember from the last module, ASP-4 can do at least two jobs. One job is to set the name attribute of this input so that when the form is submitted, ASP.NET Model Binding can say, I see this value as the value that should be placed into the restaurant ID property. ASP-4 can also set the value of this input. So if I'm editing the restaurant with an ID of 3, the value will be set to 3 for me. I don't have to set those attributes myself. Now I need the visible inputs. So let's create a div with a class of form group. And for the first input, let's edit the restaurant name. I will need a label to tell the user this is for the restaurant name. And I can do that again using ASP-4. So this is a label for restaurant.name. What ASP-4 can do in this case for me is set the for attribute to make sure that this points to the appropriate input. And now we can have the input. And the input is also ASP-4, the restaurant.name. In this case, I don't have to set the type attribute for this input. That's something else ASP-4 can do for me. It can look at the property that I'm binding against, restaurant.name, see that that is a string property and say, oh, you must want an input type equals text so you can edit a string. We'll see later how we can influence the generation of that type attribute. And I'm also going to give this a little Bootstrap styling. So this is a form control. So this block will edit the restaurant name. I'm going to copy that block and paste it because I really want the same code, but now we're going to edit the restaurant location. So I just need to change restaurant.name to restaurant.location. And now I'll paste it once again. This time we want to edit in this block the restaurant.cuisine. However, I don't want the user to have an input, especially a text input where they type in the name of the cuisine. I want to make sure they're using a specific cuisine that is available in this enum. So ideally, they will select from a list of options where those options are none, Mexican, Italian, and Indian. So what I really want to use here is not an input, but an HTML select that will build essentially a drop-down list for me. And I can give this a class of form control, and I can still use ASP-4 to say this is for restaurant.cuisine. But I also need to provide the options that are going to be available inside of this select. So when the user clicks on this select, what appears here? One way to do that is to hard code or hand code those options into the select. Another way to do that is to use another tag helper that I'll introduce you to, and that tag helper is ASP-items. So if I can bring up the IntelliSense here, so you can see that ASP-items takes an IEnumerable of select list item, so a collection of select list item. A select list item is an object that describes one of the options in a select, so it has two significant properties. One property says, here's the text to display, and the other property says, here's the value to submit when that particular entry is chosen. So the select list item is going to build my options for me, and ideally, I'll have one select list item for none, so it'll display the text none, submit the value 0, show the text Mexican, submit the value 1, Italian is 2, Indian is 3, and those are just the default values that are given because I didn't explicitly specify them. They're the values assigned by the C# compiler. So I need to build this collection of select list item, and one way to do that is to use a property that is available inside of a Razor page, which is the HTML property. It's of type iHTML-helper, and because of that, we call it the HTML helper. Many of the methods that are available on the HTML helper are methods that help you generate little snippets of HTML, or just general methods that you might find useful inside of a view. For example, get enum select list. What this can do is build a collection of select list item based on an enum type. So using reflection, it can walk through my enum of cuisine type and see there's an option none, which is 0, and Mexican, which is 1, and so forth. So I could, right here inside of the Razor page, say, let's get this enum select list using my cuisine type. And I would have to bring in a using statement to make sure that cuisine type is available. But I'm not going to use this approach. As simple as that operation is, it's also an operation that I could do inside of my page model. And anytime I have the ability to build something like the model that my CSHTML file needs to use, anytime I have the ability to do that inside of my page model instead of inside of the view itself, I want to do that inside of my page model, because quite often in the future that will make things easier to change. It also makes that particular operation easier to test. So in other words, what I want is a property that I can use with ASP-items. So a property that is of IEnumerable of select list item. That's exactly what ASP-items needs. All I need to do is bring in the namespace, which is microsoft.aspnetcore.mvc.rendering, and I can call this, let's call this cuisines, because it contains the list of cuisines that I need to bind against. So now I have two output properties, or two properties I can bind against, the restaurant that we're editing, and this additional model cuisines, which helps me build an HTML select. Now all I need to do is build this inside of my page. And just like the restaurant, I'll need to provide that information inside of onGet. Now the obstacle you might encounter is that if you try to find that same HTML helper here inside of the page model for a Razor page, you won't find a property named HTML. That's only available when I'm inside of the CSHTML file. However, just like we did with restaurant data, we can tell ASP.NET Core about other services and other components that we need to do the job. So I can ask ASP.NET Core to please provide me with an HTML helper that I can use. And once ASP.NET Core gives me that helper, I can save it off. So I can use actually control period to say, please create and initialize a field HTML helper. Now it's saved off just like my restaurant data service. And inside of the onGet method, I can say that cuisines will be equal to HTML helper.get enum select list, and then just provide my enum cuisine type as a generic type parameter. Now I have a piece of code that if in the future I need to modify this, or I need to change some of the text that is appearing, I can do that here in my page model instead of trying to place that into the view. And now coming back to the view, I can say that ASP-items equals what happens when we go to model.cuisines. So again, it's a little bit confusing, but ASP-4 always assumes that you're working on something that is on your model. So you never have to say model dot to get to the page model. I can just say restaurant.cuisine. But ASP-items, it works against a data source that could come from anywhere, so I have to specify, no, go to the model and then look at the cuisines property. And with these changes in place, I should be able to save all files. Let's come back to the browser and refresh. And I now have a form where I can edit the name, Scott's Pizza, the location, which is Maryland, and notice the cuisine. The option that is selected here is Italian, which just happens to be the cuisine for Scott's Pizza. So not only have I built a list of the available options, but the ASP-4 tag helper makes sure that the initial option that is selected matches the value that is on my model. So with this form in place, let's prepare our application to make use of the form post that happens when I click on Save.